In the United States, the middle class has long been viewed as the backbone of the nation, a symbol of stability, opportunity, and the American dream. Yet, in recent years, that foundation has shown troubling cracks. A growing number of middle-class Americans, once secure in their homes and livelihoods, are teetering on the edge of homelessness. Rising costs of living, stagnating wages, and unexpected crises, like medical emergencies or job losses, are creating a perfect storm. For many, one missed paycheck or an unexpected bill could spell disaster. Families once considered financially stable now find themselves grappling with the unthinkable, choosing between rent and groceries, or between paying for medicine and utilities. For decades, middle-class workers in America have faced a grim economic reality. Wages have stagnated while the cost of living continues to soar. Despite working full-time jobs, many Americans find themselves in a precarious financial situation, with their purchasing power steadily eroding. The relentless rise in inflation and the mounting cost of essentials have pushed countless middle-class families to the brink of homelessness, a situation exacerbated by the significant decline in the dollar's value. Since the 1990s, the dollar has lost 82% of its purchasing power. This decline means that the money earned by middle-class workers today buys significantly less than it did several decades ago. While the prices of housing, healthcare, education, and everyday necessities have increased dramatically, wages have remained relatively flat. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, real median household income has seen minimal growth over the past 20 years, failing to keep pace with inflation. This stagnation has left many families struggling to make ends meet. For many middle-class families, financial disaster is closer than they think. Despite working full-time jobs and maintaining what appears to be a stable lifestyle, the economic fragility of the middle class is more pronounced than ever. With nearly 60% of middle-class Americans having less than $1,000 in savings, the risk of falling into a homeless crisis due to an unexpected expense is alarmingly high. Like a medical bill or a car repair, can quickly spiral into a homeless crisis. How the middle class is slipping toward homelessness. Today, nearly 43 million families rent their homes, a record high number in American history. What's even more startling is the surge in middle-class renters, households earning between $56,000 and $100,000 annually that have shifted from homeownership to renting. Over the past 5 years alone, the number of such renters has increased by a staggering 86%. According to a report from Harvard University's Joint Center for Housing Studies. This shift comes at a time when rental vacancy rates are at their lowest since 1985, leaving renters scrambling for limited options and paying a premium for what they find. Housing prices have skyrocketed, with the typical home now costing $84,000 more than it did just 2 years ago. Meanwhile, average rents have risen by more than $1,150 annually compared to 2022, climbing at an annual rate of 4.5%. For middle-class renters whose incomes have declined by 9% over the past decade, these rising costs are unsustainable. The impact of this crisis can be seen in the personal stories of people like Robert Gary, a salesman from Columbus, Ohio, who once lived comfortably in the middle class. The pandemic disrupted his financial stability, and despite receiving pay raises, the relentless rise in living costs has eroded his purchasing power. In December 2023, his landlord notified him of a $250 increase in monthly rent, bringing his total to $1,960, an amount that consumes half of his income. "I'm living paycheck to paycheck and barely making it," Gary lamented in an interview. "No one cares anymore. Companies are out there taking as much as they can get, unable to afford the increase." Gary was forced to move in with a friend while searching for more affordable options, an increasingly difficult task in neighborhoods he feels safe in. Gary's story is far from unique. Similar scenarios are playing out across the country, pushing middle-class renters into precarious living situations or forcing them to downgrade their quality of life. Why rent is crushing the middle class. The burden of housing costs weighs heavily on America's middle class. Researchers have found that 21.2% of middle-class homeowners and a staggering 46.3% of middle-class renters spend more than the recommended 30% of their income on housing. Even more alarming, a significant number of these households spend over 50%, placing them in the severely burdened category. This financial strain limits their ability to save, invest, or maintain a comfortable standard of living, leaving little room for emergencies or future planning. The problem is exacerbated by a property price boom that has rendered homeownership unattainable for many. Over 70% of homes are now out of reach for first-time buyers with middle incomes. Rising interest rates, the highest in over a decade, have only worsened the situation, forcing prospective homeowners to save for an additional year just to secure a 20% down payment. This extended timeline delays the dream of homeownership, pushing many to remain renters and further straining an already limited rental market. Rents, meanwhile, continue to rise sharply, consuming larger shares of household income. In cities like Boston, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C., median rents hover between $2,800 and $3,200 per month. For context, in Boston, where the median rent reached $2,780 in February, a household would need to earn at least $127,000 annually to afford housing under the standard affordability guideline. Yet, essential workers like elementary school teachers and registered nurses, earning $68,000 and $73,000 respectively, fall far short of this threshold. Such disparities underscore the grim reality that even middle-class professionals are being priced out of urban housing markets. The forces driving this crisis are multifaceted. Millennials, burdened by student debt and stuck in low-paying jobs, fuel demand for affordable rental housing but find themselves excluded from home ownership. Baby boomers, downsizing in retirement, further compete for desirable apartments in city centers. Former homeowners who lost their properties to foreclosure add to the rental demand, alongside those unable to secure mortgages due to tightened credit standards. Everyone, it seems, is vying for the same limited supply of housing in walkable, transit-accessible neighborhoods, close to jobs, a demand far outpacing supply. Why even high earners can't afford rent anymore. A report by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition reveals that renters must earn an average of $21.21 per hour to afford a modest two-bedroom apartment, far above the national hourly wage average of $16.38. This disparity is pushing many middle-class renters into financial precarity. In cities like San Francisco, the upfront costs of renting an average apartment often exceed $12,000, a figure that excludes the ongoing strain of monthly payments. The missing middle, individuals earning too much to qualify for subsidies but not enough to thrive in the open market, has effectively been squeezed out of middle-income neighborhoods. The roots of this crisis stretch back to the Great Recession, a period when construction came to a virtual standstill. As Andre Bueno, founder of the Los Angeles-based real estate investment firm Bueno Group, noted, "We didn't build anything during the recession. That's still biting us today. The long-term consequences are evident." In 2010, the rental market began to shift as middle-class renters, historically less reliant on the rental market, surged into it. Families who once earned less than $30,000 a year dominated the rental landscape, but today, even those with six-figure incomes find themselves unable to buy or rent in many cities. The plight of middle-income renters is compounded by stagnating wage growth and rising costs across all aspects of life, from housing to health care, gasoline to groceries. For many, saving for a down payment or even meeting the high cost of city rentals is a near impossible task. Experts like Michelle Dickerson of the University of Texas underscore that this is not solely a problem for the very poor. It increasingly affects families with good jobs, whose earnings neither qualify them for subsidized housing nor position them to navigate the inflated market with ease. A family that makes $100,000 can't afford to buy a house in most U.S. cities. Dickerson observes, a sentiment echoed by analysts who estimate that raising a middle-class family comfortably now requires an income approaching $300,000 annually. This crisis reveals deeper systemic issues: a lack of affordable housing, unchecked inflation, and inadequate wage growth. Why living costs crush dreams. The warning signs are clear. The financial instability gripping everyday Americans is a precursor to greater distress. If left unaddressed, the housing crisis will not only devastate families, but also weaken the foundations of the nation's economy. As real estate prices continue to rise and affordable options dwindle, the risk of systemic collapse looms ever larger. The question is no longer whether change is needed, but how long the nation can afford to wait before taking action. In the face of this mounting crisis, one thing is certain: the cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of change. At the heart of this crisis lies an undeniable truth. Housing costs don't just determine where people live. They shape every aspect of their lives. A study by Apartment List reveals that cost-burdened households, which spend more than 30% of their income on rent, allocate 41% less on food, and a staggering 74% less on health care. For these households, the trade-offs are stark: feeding their families or seeing a doctor, staying warm in winter or saving for the future. Across the United States, approximately 51 million households are unable to afford a basic monthly budget that includes necessities like housing, food, childcare, and transportation. This gap between income and expenses exposes the fragility of the middle class and underscores the systemic flaws in the nation's housing infrastructure. The ripple effects of this crisis are profound and far-reaching. According to Kim Betancourt, head of family research at Fannie Mae, the lack of affordable housing is causing a cascading effect throughout the economy. When lower-income families are priced out of affordable housing, they are forced into units that traditionally house middle-class families. Meanwhile, the middle class, squeezed by rising costs, finds itself struggling to maintain its footing, perpetuating a chain reaction that destabilizes the entire economic ladder. Sydney Bennett, a senior research associate at Apartment List, emphasizes the consequences of this gap: systemic poverty and an increasingly unequal society, where only the wealthiest can afford to own homes and build equity, while the middle class is hollowed out. The threat of homelessness. The middle class frequently finds itself invisible in discussions about social welfare. The spotlight on safety net programs like housing assistance and food stamps typically highlights the needs of the most impoverished, leaving many middle-class families without support during financial crises. This oversight has profound consequences, particularly when these families face the threat of homelessness and find themselves helpless in their dire situations. Consider the story of Mark and Lisa, a couple who worked diligently to provide a comfortable life for their children. Both held steady jobs, paid their bills on time, and managed to save a little each month. However, when Mark was laid off during an economic downturn, their financial stability quickly unraveled. The loss of income, combined with the rising cost of healthcare and utilities, drained their savings. Unable to qualify for social welfare programs designed for the most impoverished, they found themselves unable to pay their mortgage and were eventually forced out of their home. The plight of middle-class families like Mark and Lisa highlights a critical gap in the social welfare system. Programs such as housing assistance and food stamps are vital for those in deep poverty, but they often exclude those who fall just above the eligibility threshold. This exclusion leaves middle-class families vulnerable, with no safety net to catch them when they fall. As a result, they can find themselves in the devastating position of facing homelessness without any support. Another example is David, a middle-aged father of two who has worked in manufacturing for over 20 years. Despite his loyalty and hard work, David has not seen a significant wage increase in years. The rising cost of living has outpaced his earnings, forcing him to rely on credit to pay for essentials. When his factory downsized, David was left without a job and with mounting debt. Unable to keep up with his mortgage, He and his family face eviction and now live in temporary housing, uncertain about their future. Without adequate wages to support them, many middle-class families turn to credit cards and loans to cover their expenses, leading to an alarming rise in debt levels. The Federal Reserve reports that household debt has reached unprecedented levels, further straining the financial health of the average American.